The goal of this exercise is to respond to the United Nations' wish to have guiding principles on public-private partnerships that are consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and with the whole 2030 development agenda. We have gone through one or two periods of developing guidelines at various other venues, and what you see now is the latest version. It's not a final version, it's the latest version. That's good and bad. Bad, well, we should be moving on a little bit faster. Good, it gives us all an opportunity to make comments that will be taken in board. The final part, the next steps, before I go into what we're going to do today, I can tell you what the next steps are. We want to go now into a kind of technical working team that would, in quieter surroundings, but very, very quickly, work out these guiding principles in a more final form. Let me give you a little bit, I believe, let me first of all identify and mention who we're very fortunate to have working with us from the panel. And then I will also mention people who are coming in from WebEx, and some of them are coming in at very strange hours. So let me start off with this. In our panelists, we have Alekos Michailidis, who is from the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Transport from Cyprus, and he is on our bureau of the intergovernmental body, this working party on public-private partnerships. So Alekos, thank you very much for joining us. Ziad Hayek is from Lebanon, from the Higher Council for Privatization. He is the head of that organization. He's also hosting one of the specialist centers on the area of ports. So Ziad, welcome. Irina Kalenchkak is from the Ministry of Economy of Belarus. And Irina, you're most welcome. Thank you very much for coming. Now from outside this room, we have a lady I met a few weeks ago in New York, Claudia LaRue. She's an expert. She's very excellent expert on public-private and multi-stakeholder partnerships, and she's from the Dominican Republic. And a gentleman called Felix Dodds, who's Senior Fellow from the Global Research Institute in the United States, and he's been doing some very interesting work and guidelines himself on the concept of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And also we have as well James Goldstein, and he's an Associate Fellow from TELUS Institute, and again, that is in the United States. So this is a very broad group, but very top level, very senior, people who can give us some excellent contributions. I wanted just to give very briefly, if I may, a little bit about the story. Public-private partnerships as a concept was never meant to be directly linked to poverty alleviation and sustainable development. Its early days were primarily as an efficiency tool to provide taxpayers with value for money. What we have now is a completely new challenge and a question: are PPP fit for purpose? And and how does the model have to be revised to make them fit for purpose for the UN Sustainable Development Goals? The way we see this is it has to be made fit for purpose, because there are not many alternatives open to governments to meet the massive price tag that is required to achieve the sustainable goals: water for all, energy for all, and so on. So the task really is to identify the new model and also the principles and guidelines to make that new model operational. So that's what the task is, and this is the document that says it. So if you've got this document before you, and again, thank you to all the staff who made a big effort in bringing this to our attention and also making the photocopies. The first part is as an introduction, which has just basically said what I said just a moment ago. We have to look at PPP more than value for money. And there will be three parts of this, demonstrating why it's important to align PPP. That's making PPP more consistent with the UN Development Agenda. Secondly, identifying the principles, and that's what we would probably call 7 principles. It could be more principles, it could be less principles. And then setting out an action program. We have to remember, this is not just a conclave of interested people in PPP, just having an idea and enjoying themselves in this. We have to translate the principles into action. As somebody said, I think it was me, the challenge is not to interpret and reinterpret PPP, it's to transform the world. So we have to get this into an action program. I just wonder if Pedro Neves is here. I can't see Pedro. Yes, he is here. Well, then that's helpful. I can wait to him as well. We move now on to the second part, which is the background to the document. And here from pages 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7, we describe what we would consider to be best practices in public-private partnerships. What's the essential element? And I think the interesting issue here is something called output specifications. A lot of people say, oh, PPP is not going to work. It's definitely going to be lacking transparency and accountability. It's just not a model that's fit for purpose. And the thing is, as experts, we understand what output specifications are, but it's a very difficult concept. Output specifications is what goes into a contract that is different from traditional public procurement. So the output specifications are those which a government formulates in order to ensure performance by the private sector to achieve what the contract's all about. And the output specifications are something like, transparency. How do you engage stakeholders in a project, in a community? And how would you put that into an output specification so that the private sector actually does this? Now that's something which has not been understood by some of our experts in some of the other areas, maybe the non-PPP circuits. Basically, it's the fact that you have flexibility and you can make this contract work for the Sustainable Development Goals. Just nobody's bothered about it. The only project that actually was used for poverty eradication in a very successful way was this famous Pamir project in Tajikistan, where a number of stakeholders, including the Swiss Economic Cooperation Organization, the IFC, and others, made a project which eradicated poverty in the power sector, and very, very successfully. But that was never generalized, either in Tajikistan, or never really became a common model. And I think what we have to do is look at that case study, get the lessons, and try and see how we can sort of generalize it. So that's so that discussion on these pages is really to demonstrate the best practices that can come out of PPP. But there's a but, and that but is about contingent liabilities. It's about the debts that can run up if a government isn't very careful in taking on new commitments as a result of the project. And of course there are two types of models. One is the user pay model, and there the debts that can be run up are not as excessive or as dangerous as, there are some liabilities, but they're not as dangerous and as excessive as availability payment forms. And these two types of models have to be mentioned and described in these guiding principles. It's not an easy concept, but this is very, very important because again, PPP has to be used carefully, cautiously by people who know, and we also have the Addis Ababa Action Agenda where the principles are actually mentioned, and one is to be cautious relative to this particular point about contingent liabilities. So there has to be a discussion there. That is that part, that section. In section 8, we describe the sectoral performance of PPPs. And this has been a gap up until now, I hope, where people don't know really how does PPP in the water sector do? How does PPP in the renewable sector? And is it applicable? Is People First PPP applicable for everything? Well, I would argue that if we look at the using the actual principle that I discussed, output specifications, I would say that you have possibilities, but there is a hypothesis that public-private only works in the big sectors which are generating revenue, like transport and revenue upfront, like transport and energy, but are not so applicable in the social sectors. And of course, that's where the challenge of the model of the SDGs are. Anyway, there's a review from pages 8, 9, 10 of different sectors. And again, this is still quite a work in progress because there isn't terribly much information that actually provides views on what the PPP is doing in different sectors. So that's going to be quite valuable for the United Nations if we can provide that sort of data. So that leads us then to the question of People First on page 13. We describe the fact that the development agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals focuses on things that were not really common to PPP, things like inclusiveness, no one left behind, resilience, which is climate change, which wasn't discussed in the Millennium Development Goals, equity, which is always a difficult concept, how PPP can create a more equal society. And extrapolating from that, we come up with what we call the criteria for People First public-private partnerships. And we've identified 5 criteria: increase access to essential services. Again, I'm reading from page 13 in the middle of the page. Increase access to essential service, enhance resilience and more care with the environment, improving economic effectiveness, which might be a value for money, and promote replicability in the development of further projects. This is simply because PPP can't be a one-off model. It has to be a transformative tool. We heard yesterday Chris Heathcote describing transformation in PPP and the work they were trying to do, that the road shouldn't just be a road, but it should go in and have an accelerator, multiplier impact on the economy. So it's going to be a road plus something else that's going to really be able to do this. And of course, replicability deals with training. We have to look at training because we can't, and we've had some discussions yesterday, we've looked at training, but that's the big problem. How do we train? How do we train effectively? And we know that we've attended trainings of 2 days, 3 days, and we know that after that nothing happens. So we've got to look and see how training becomes really effective. And I see Sam Tabucci here, and Sam taught me that you can do so much by doing projects. And I think that's our principle. And also Belarus have also shown the fact that you can mobilize interest, incentives. You know, if you've got an incentive, you'll do it. And the Belarus saw that they were going to do a project, so they went through the various hoops to get to that happy situation. And I think Belarus is a tremendous case and should be definitely involved in this, in the articulations of the principles. And then the final one, the final criteria is fully involve all stakeholders in the projects. So those would be the criteria. And then the last page, well, the last part 2, which for some reason has part 3, if you like, page 15. I think that's a little bit of that is a typo. We're at part 2. And these are the introduction to the guiding principles. I would also ask you to look at the bottom of page 15, because you have the Addis Ababa Action Principles. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda lists, in paragraph 48 of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, they have said, let's have some guidance on PPPs, but first of all, it should be careful that PPPs should give careful consideration to the structure and use of blended finance instruments, share risks and rewards fairly, meet social environmental standards, align with sustainable development, ensure sustainable, accessible, affordable and resilient quality infrastructure, ensure clear accountability and mechanisms, ensure transparency, including in public procurement frameworks and contracts, ensure participation of local communities in decisions affecting their communities, ensuring effective management, accounting and budgeting for contingent liabilities, well, I talked about that, and then alignment with national priorities and relevant principles of effective development cooperation. So these are very good principles, but we have to now put some flesh onto them in the guiding principles. Just to recap, this is not just this is a global effort involving different stakeholders under the UN as a whole. And so it's very important that we take these principles and sort of integrate them into whatever we're going to say. So now finalizing just, and I hope you're all with me and not, I'm sure you might be falling asleep, and don't worry if you do, but I'd like you just to go into the 7 guiding principles. And we had 7 principles for the 2008 version of the Good Governance Guideline, and I think I can see, is Art Smith here? 1 or 2 of us were involved in that, and we definitely need Art involved in this new version. But what we want is to look at the 7 guiding principles of what we would like to see as being the guiding principles for the new development agenda under the UN 2030 development agenda. And we thought that good governance, good project selection, replicability, balanced risk allocation, stakeholder engagement, sustainability, and then resiliency. We thought that the actual environmental agenda that's been set since, which is the new topic, it's the new topic, how do you adjust to the extremes that are coming about as a result of global warming, the flooding, the unpredictability, the greater risk. How do you deal with that, and how can public-private make a difference there? So the 7th principle, resiliency, is very important. And then there's some very brief attempts to put the principles. I think in the revised version, we'll probably look at the issues under each of these principles and then come up with the principles. And then we have actually got a version of the agenda for action, because I think we insist that we should not just preside a document for people's enjoyment. This is to be put into an action program, so we will include that. I'm sorry to take that time, but I know that you hadn't read the document, and I hope that that synthesis of mine has given some help there. I think maybe, and I'm awfully sorry to ask you if you could come and give some comments at this stage. But maybe would someone like to make a general comment on this exercise? Maybe mention that what you think the value of these guiding principles will be. We set some questions for this particular session, so maybe we should see. One of the debates in New York were whether new principles were actually needed, and there is a lot of guidance now in public-private partnerships. A lot of people actually, a lot of the private sector get rather angry, particularly in Britain, that there's just too much guidance, and they say this is, instead of making things clearer, they just add to confusion. And of course the last thing you want is one UN agency doing its guidelines and another agency doing its guidelines. So we've got to look into this, whether it's one UN. But I think our argument, and again this is open for discussion, is that because we're talking about a new model, we have to talk about a new set of guidelines to meet that model. So therefore, it is valuable to consider a new set of guidelines at this time. Well, would you like to take the floor and be the first? Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks,
very much.
Jeffrey. Yes, I believe that we do need guidelines, because especially if we are talking about this new model, the word new needs some explanation and some guidance. The other thing is that from the theory to practice, there is always a big gap.
Yes.
So even if we have, let's say, even if we are in a country where there is the most appropriate legislative framework, we need some guidance principles to help those people that are going to work on a PPP. And so I believe that because of these 2 reasons, yes, we need to have these guidelines. Now, as you said, Jeffrey, PPP is a very strong tool to achieve things. And today, it is impossible for many governments, even governments in rich countries, to implement all those projects that the society is needed. So that is why we are thinking of PPP, because through PPP we can make use of private funds, we can make use of private experience, and we can combine the expertise of the government and the expertise of the private sector in order to achieve our goals. And especially in countries where there is poverty, yes, PPP has a major role to play, because we can find ways to fight this poverty through these PPP structures. And so I believe that, yes, we need to work on those lines if we would like to achieve more projects, especially in the countries where they need all these projects. Well,
Thank you. Elena, would you like to make a point? Thank you very much.
Да, добрый день. Я буду говорить на русском. Для нас ГЧП – это очень новый механизм, и мы провели очень большую работу совместно с экспертами.
Significant work with our specialists.
you have it here, Alekos. Yeah, but I need
Just in case.
So we continue. Thank you. The PPP mechanism is totally new for us. So we found this process. We arrived to this process with very strong support of specialists of United Nations and from our business council. My colleague will present you with some details during the following sessions regarding the process of implementing the PPP. It was a serious contribution to the sustainable development in Belarus, and our tasks are coming in line with the global tasks of the sustainable development. It is very important for us to allocate appropriate resources and create appropriate conditions for us to implement our solutions on the social level. Therefore, we consider the PPP mechanism to be very progressive in what it comes. It's not just a particular tool to achieve our tasks, but it's a tool to share experience of the management experience and to achieve new level in providing the services for our population. It is very important to implement the guiding principles, because whenever you have certain benchmarks in front of you, it would be much easier to complete the preparatory stage. It is quite impressive what we have achieved during the last 2.5 years in forming the plan of infrastructure in our country, but we still have plenty of future tasks. And briefly describing those tasks, I would like to mention that we follow the guiding principles. Our legal basis is not yet ready. It's being developed at this point. We are considering quite a number of the projects, and we are discovering the methods and mechanisms to choose people-first projects, to prioritize the projects. I believe it is very important. So we also hope that international specialists would be able to help our country, especially those that worked for a long time in this area. It's very important. It is a very important component of the system to create a potential. We understand that to create any good product, we need the help of the specialists. We pay plenty of attention to educational issues. However, beyond education, we need to have very stable conditions for the specialists to remain and work in where they work. At this moment, this issue is still under consideration. We would like to hear comments of our colleagues and specialists. How could we interest those specialists? How can we create a stable system? We believe that education alone will not create results that we would like to have. It is important to test those results in practice. Therefore, what we do while we're preparing our first project, it's very good practical experience for us. We are learning from this practical experience. We are solving particular questions. We are adjusting our legal basis. We are applying new financial models. We estimate the flows, economical flows generated by these projects. Therefore, the potential could only be created during our practical work. But we believe that our pilot projects, in order not to be alone, we would have to think about the future, and we would have to create certain stable approach to prioritize and to develop a portfolio of the projects. Yesterday we heard some opinions that in certain countries the number of projects is approaching thousands. We do not talk about such huge scale. We would be happy to develop the first projects and to have satisfactory results. However, as long as we have at least a document, a guiding document with guiding principles, that would be much easier for us to be aware where we should pay attention, which areas would require certain adjustment in our legislature. And it's a very important work. Thank you very much.
Very much indeed, Irina. I mean, I think it's not a how-to-do guide. I mean, my goodness, that would take mammoth amounts of paper and destroying many parts of our environment. It's going to be the principles, and I'm happy to hear that you are interested in getting these principles that can guide your subsequent actions. I'm also interested about experts, because I'm wondering, you know, what happens once you do your pilot projects in Belarus. Are you going to then have the capability within the government to carry on with more, or will you still need experts to guide you into the process? And that's something I hadn't thought about. And there's always the issue of once you have people within the government who are doing the projects in the infancy, then once things go into a next stage, they tend to join, they leave the government and go into private sector. So that also is another issue. Ziad, would you care to say a few things?
Sure, thank you, Jeffrey, and take advantage of being on the stage here to thank you UNECE, thank City University for hosting us, and for giving us all the opportunity to exchange ideas and learn from each other. I think, as this paper states, as we know, and I think as Mr. Tingley so well put it yesterday, we are looking at 3 generations of PPP. We're looking at PPP as an instrument to finance projects. That is how things started, how to take advantage of the expertise of the private sector, how to get its funding involved in providing services. Second generation was one that we are all familiar with, where we started talking about PPP programs. It was no longer about financing a particular project. It was about PPP programs with some economic policy perspective, thinking of PPP as a way to finance infrastructure, that can then enhance economic development and create jobs. And we are now, with goal number 17, starting to look at the third generation of PPP perspectives, and that is how PPP can be an instrument in improving human life. And this is a very lofty and worthy goal. It is something that, this is, I think, what we are here when we talk about People First PPP. This is what we're trying to do. We are trying to think beyond the financing of projects, beyond the building of infrastructure and job creation, as to how we affect people's lives. This is something that requires many, many things coming together. And I think this paper is excellent in sort of giving the guiding principles, talking about the main ideas that need to be explored and implemented. I think to be able to get to that third level, we need to change perspectives. We need to change the perspective of governments, change the perspective of people. Of course, at a very basic level, we need to have, for example, people stop thinking of PPP as semi-privatization, and therefore all the negative aspects that many people link with that. We need to have governments start thinking about the goals, and goal number 17 included in them. That requires a change of perspective as well. I think the UN has a very important role to play here, because it is one thing for the World Bank or the IMF to come in and say, Mr. Minister or Mr. Prime Minister or Mr. President, you need to change your policy to be able to involve the private sector in financing projects or whatever. It's very different when it comes from the UN as somebody, as an organ that is disinterested in the financing of projects and more interested in development of the human being and creating policies for the human being. So from a political side as opposed from the economic side, and popularizing this idea that PPP is a way to improve people's lives, I think, is something that needs to be communicated politically, even much more so than economically. To do that, I think you need to be able to also involve stakeholders. As Raymond Sanner well said yesterday, particularly civil society, because it is not only enough to have politicians and bankers thinking that PPP is a good idea. You need grassroots support, and you need people, civil society, to start seeing it as an instrument for it to achieve its goals as well. And so it puts a responsibility on all of us involved in PPP to open up, to not be worried, not fear the inclusion of civil society in decision-making, in designing projects. In Lebanon, for example, in our legislation, we're talking about involving all stakeholders. Now, somebody initially said, wait a minute, you involve all stakeholders, that is going to mean, that projects will take forever to be approved. But we're not giving all the stakeholders veto power on getting projects approved and done. What we're talking about is consultation, but serious consultation, and taking everybody's input so that everybody feels that they have bought into a particular project when that project is implemented, and not thinking that this has been imposed on them and therefore they're going to fight it, and they're going to fight it for 20 years or 30 years. It does not create a healthy situation in society for there to be people fighting your projects. So this is why it is very important to include everybody, and including everybody is a means also of ensuring transparency. And so all of these things are linked. So you involve the stakeholders, which is principle number 5 here, guiding principle number 5, But interestingly enough, through transparency, you get to good governance at the end of the day. And you need to ensure transparency. If you don't have transparency, there's, again, people are going to fight it. Again, you don't have good governance, so you cannot achieve your principle number one. I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to take all the time, so you stop me if you think I should stop here.
Well, you've said some very interesting things, and thank you very much. Just before some of the technical things, because I'm now going to talk to people outside the room, are any people wanting to make some remarks about what they've heard so far? If you can help me, I'm getting a little bit dazzled, but I think we've got some leeway. No, yes, Alan, would you maybe the microphone to Alan? And maybe say who you are, and so that we, and just a question, maybe just Alan, just a brief question. We've got to get on, because I need to talk to people who are probably about to go into their beds in America. So please, Alan. Yeah.
Just a quick one. Based on the comments of Mr. Hayek here, I just would like to add that perhaps for the advice of the panel, is it possible to structure a multi-tier PPP projects where, for example, you are taking a high-value project on a PPP structure, such as sort of independent power, plant, the producer on a power purchase agreement contract, and then have it multi-layered, whereby the local provincial government and the grassroots level projects can also be linked to benefit that as one of the minor stakeholders, because you have a long-term revenue stream.
Wow, you're great, Alan. That's quite a task to reply to it. Anyone want to make a remark there?
Sure. We've had PPP projects where the local government was fighting the project, and because they were not involved in it, they were not consulted, etc. Sometimes there's also been the opposite, where a local government has started a PPP project and the federal government or the central government has not been happy with it. I give examples. For example, I'll take Lebanon. We have two examples, and maybe that will get me to answer your question. So we have a touristic site. It's called the Jaita Grotto, and the Ministry of Tourism gave a license to a company or a PPP project for a company that operates it. And the municipality was not consulted. So every time this management company tries to, say, expand the cafeteria on the site or build an area for kids to play, etc., the municipality would come and stop the works and interfere and not want to have that project, they don't want to have the company do anything. Had the municipality been involved early on and maybe received some part of the revenues of that project, they may have been perceiving it differently. On the other side, we have the city of Sidon that has built through a PPP project with the municipality, built a waste treatment plant, a solid waste treatment plant, and part of the agreement was to give the plant authority to use some of the shore area. And since the shore in Lebanon is controlled by the Ministry of Public Works, and the Ministry of Public Works was not consulted, the Ministry of Public Works refused to let the solid waste plant use that area that it needed in order to store the waste and operate the plant. And so in the meantime, we had a mountain of solid waste piling up on the other side of the city, falling down with every storm into the Mediterranean, polluting the water, while the waste treatment plant stood idle. So it took a long time until something was negotiated where the municipality could still get preferential fee for treating its solid waste, but then the plant would also operate to treat the waste of other municipalities at a different rate, and eventually something was worked out. But there's no need for all that heartache. There's no need for all of this to take years and years. This could have been prevented by people working together from day one.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to take a little bit thinking of my Mediterranean holiday plans if waste is piling into the lovely waters not nearby you. But I think these are tremendously illustrative examples, so thank you. Can I ask people now who would like to join us? Claudia LaRue.
Jeff?
Yes.
One more comment, please.
Sorry, Rich, I didn't see you.
Thank you. What's been accomplished?
Sorry, just mention your name, please.
Richard Ornan, Symphonyx Capital, been privileged to be involved with this since... I've been privileged to be involved with this for 20 years. The guidelines are a major accomplishment, and they obviously help a lot. From my perspective today as an investor, and I think one of the few people here who actually puts money on the line, I'd like to make a suggestion that UNECE go a step further, that it provide a rating system, and the rating system be twofold. The first fold is that the compliance of the country in the framework with the guiding principles, and that can easily be done. And that can be in simple terms, very compliant, compliant, not compliant. But then beyond that, what's very helpful, certainly on the investor side, it costs us $2 to $4 million to evaluate a project and bid. So if there could also be a rating of the projects by the UN, either as bankable, very bankable, not bankable. So 3 simple standards. 1, to rate the countries, and 2, to rate the projects. It would help the investment community. Is this viable at all?
Well, it's a very well put question, and in fact there is a process going on within the Business Advisory Board that you are indeed a member of, Richard, to develop the evaluation, to develop perhaps something that could lead to a credit rating scheme using the 5 criteria. We still have to get validation on the value of these 5 criteria, but if we can get that, we can get into this sort of takeoff point, and this is the whole challenge, making sure that these guiding principles are actionable by exactly the constituency that Richard talks about, by people with money, this needs quite a bit of thought. Maybe, Tony, we could think maybe just tomorrow morning a meeting of some people who would like to take this forward, the evaluation methodology and ratings, and see, you know, this question and if we can operationalize it. Anyone else like to make a comment?
Well,
yes,
I don't know how easy it is to, let's say, rate the countries and how reliable this is.
Yeah.
But this brings me to the one principle that we have in front of us in page 16 about the balanced risk allocation. If during the preparation of the project we have a balanced risk allocation, then investors know very well how to, let's say, approach their clients and their needs for financing. If also there are some, let's say, protections during the duration of a project for these investors and for these concessionaires, then again, this is something that helps the implementation of a project. And when I say some protection, what do I mean? For instance, say that we have a project with a duration of 25 years. And we don't have any change in law, let's say, terms in our contract. And all of a sudden there is a change in law in that country, which brings a lot of responsibilities and a lot of burden onto the shoulders of the concessionaire. Then yes, you have a problem. But if we have the so-called change in law, and especially change in discriminatory laws, and when we do have these changes, we protect the concessionaire, covering the additional burden, then the investors know already from the beginning that in such a case there is a protection.
Yeah.
So balanced risk allocation is a key principle.
Yeah.
And it's very, very important when we are preparing a project to think twice about this risk allocation.
Yeah.
So I believe that is through this principle that we can, let's say, give a comfort to the investors.
That's a very good point, and it's not just a change of law, it's whether, you know, some new administration comes in and decides it doesn't like the project, and then the whole project is completely changed or stopped. And if you're an investor, you're not going to put money into such unpredictable circumstances. So you obviously have to have a political regime which gives assurances, a consistency, and then that the new incoming government, if it has been a re-election, an election, is committed to taking on the previous obligations. This gets kind of politically charged, but I think you have leverage here because the Sustainable Development Goals are commitments made by governments. So it's not beyond, I know someone has talked about insurance schemes and so on and so forth. It's difficult, but I think we have to look at risk very, very closely in the guiding principles.
Jeff, could I make
yes, sorry.
not specifically about this, but just continuing on, on the general principles. I wanted to say that the principle number 3, replicability, is very important if we are going to make PPP something that goes beyond financing a particular project. If it's going to affect the life of millions of people in all our countries, we need to find ways to make these projects replicable more easily. And we need to work on models. We perhaps need contribution of everybody. And I think in that sense, the centers of excellence and the standards go a long way towards achieving that, whether it is the various standards that that UNECE has been developing. They're very, very important, or like I said, the centers where we collect information about. So this is, while we're looking at the macro, we should not forget the micro, the micro. We should not forget when we're talking about PPP as affecting development politics and policies. We should always still remember that it is, you know, the micro, the little things in the contract, the clauses, the etc. that needs and I congratulate UNECE for taking the lead in setting the standards and setting the international centers of excellence. The other thing I wanted to say is about accountability, because this is something we hear a lot about. You know, how, you know, people think that once you let the private sector in and the private sector is involved, then they're less accountable. I would argue exactly the opposite. I think that holding a government accountable, holding a ministry accountable is nonsensical. It's very vague. You have to wait till the next elections to vote some party or some minister out of, or member of parliament out of office. And by then, nobody remembers exactly why and how. This is very vague accountability. Accountability in PPP is very direct, because now you have a private sector entity operating a particular project. You can sue that entity. You can go to courts. And so the accountability is much more direct. And I think we should all keep that in mind when we think about these things.
I'm drafting as you speak, Ziad. Thank you. Can I just talk to people outside? Are there any people outside? I'm talking to James Goldstein, Felix Dodds, Claudia LaRue. Are any people from outside listening? Maybe Claudio could give me some indication as people on WebEx are involved. Tony, have we got anyone?
Yes, Jeffrey, everyone is following the meeting.
Okay.
They are ready to start.
Could you then, Claudio, give the floor to Claudia LaRue?
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. I'll do. Claudia, please, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I'm stupid. It's on but it's behind my back. Someone should...
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good morning to you. Can you hear me well?
Beautifully,
Perfectly well,
beautifully.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to UNECE for inviting me to be a panelist here. I'm very honored. And since I know that time is of the essence, I would like to focus my remarks from what we're learning from MSPs and applying it to what you are doing on PPPs. Specifically, if we look at page 14 of the guiding principles paper that you presented to us today, I need to say at the very onset that I cannot stress enough the point that UN-wide guidelines versus separate guidelines by each UN agency, program, and fund are very important for member states to ensure policy consistency across the UN system. One of the panelists was talking about PPP guidelines from the World Bank versus UN guidelines referring to the political aspect. I would like to tell you that our situation with MSPs is a lot more complicated. We have different agencies, funds, and programs that have separate guidelines, and there's absolutely no consistency. I think that the work you are doing on PPPs is cannot be seen as useful, but rather as necessary. It's a necessity. In fact, I actually told one of your colleagues, Tony Bonici, that I was jealous because you seem to be on the way of creating something that will be used system-wide while we are still struggling to discuss common guidelines that can be used for MSPs. When it comes to uniformity of guidelines, we should have criteria that is applicable across the board. In our case, for example, are there industries that we will be working with versus others that we will not? We have the case of some agencies that work with a certain type of industry while others will not. And we need to define, and I agree with what the panelists were saying about due diligence standards. Some agencies have very stringent processes while others do not. And we have cases where private companies have been rejected by some agencies, but have been embraced by others. And this cannot continue to happen. And it's something that can also happen in PPPs if there are no system-wide guidelines. I apologize for being so negative in a way and for being giving you warnings, but we are facing a struggle right now. And your process is actually giving us hope to what we can achieve in our discussion on MSPs. One other point that I would like to make is that once we have the guidelines in place, entities need to be encouraged to report on how they comply with the guidelines. And we are thinking about also having an online database to report on this, because we believe that transparency and accountability go hand in hand. And it is also something that has been mentioned when it comes to PPPs. So that is what I have to say for now, and I can clarify later. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. What time is it there with you?
It's 10:15 in the evening.
Okay, well, thank goodness it's not so early, and it's very nice to see you, and thank you so much for making the effort. Well, I think your point is extremely well. Can I just add some information? you used the word MSP, and I think a lot of people here won't know exactly what you're referring to. In fact, Claudia is referring to multi-stakeholder partnerships. And the UN has been involved in the development of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And what Claudia is saying is that there are too many different UN bodies developing too many different guidelines and multi-stakeholder partnerships. So there's a complete lack of coordination, and that can be very demoralizing. So she's actually saying to us, if you can try to get these guiding principles as one UN, that will be a tremendous relief for the whole UN system, so that we won't have one group competing against another. To be honest, I think in the UN system we tend to be the best organization in terms of our expertise, so we are fortunate there aren't terribly many competitors, but the point really is that we have to be vigilant and try always at the same time bring other agencies if they want to join. And then I think the second question about reporting compliance, as I said, we have to get these guidelines out, and people have to become ready to say how they're being implemented. And on the next version, we'll have to identify the reporting mechanisms. Reporting sounds, I hate the word reporting just simply because I don't want to do it, because I never think that people listen to what I my reports. I've been a bureaucrat for 25 years. I've written lovely reports, and they've gone into somebody's cupboard. What we need to think of is a reporting mechanism which perhaps doesn't use that word in a negative sense, but in a more positive sense. But Claudia, thank you very much. The other people on there is Felix Dodds. Felix, are you listening to me? Would you like to make some comments?
Yes, I would.
Thanks,
can
Felix.
you hear me as well?
I can hear you fine.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Felix. And what time is it with you?
I'm in California, going off to the Palm Spring Film Festival tomorrow, so I'm enjoying myself.
Fantastic.
So I'm just going to make a few comments. One, on just building a little bit on what Claudia was saying on multi-stakeholder partnerships, and in a sense, linking it back to, I don't know who it was in the audience there or speakers who was talking about the opportunity to, in a sense, rate PPPs. We are actually going to be starting a process in July, slightly outside the UN, to look at doing that with MSPs, to develop a charter based on sets of principles which may not yet be negotiated by the UN, but there needs to be a set of principles which we can judge whether an MSP is a good MSP or isn't a good MSP, because I think we're in the process, maybe not as many MSPs as there are PPPs, but there's over 3,000, I think, now that are associated with the SDGs, and we need to be able to judge those. Just a side comment, there is a process called the Benchmarking Alliance, which has already done a benchmarking on human rights based on the Ruggie principles for companies. And so by producing a benchmark on how companies are doing, they are using the reports that you hate to write, but which are judging whether a company is improving or not. And that is having an impact on the context of whether those companies try to improve themselves. And they're about to start a process to do benchmarking for companies around all of the SDGs. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at. A third comment is try not to mix up the two different discourses between civil society and stakeholders. They are different. Civil society tends to be anyone who isn't government or industry, and you tend to miss specific stakeholders by putting it into that general category. I think it's much better to use the term stakeholder, because then you can really start to map out who should be in there and should be part of the decision-making process. But I would just make that comment. I think, the previous sets of PPPs have raised a lot of concern with different stakeholder groups over the last 20 years. So we're in a situation where they start from a slightly negative situation. What UNECE is doing in a very transparent and open process is, I think, exactly what needs to be done to try and move PPPs into a positive place. One of the things I think that perhaps needs to be considered is, one of the issues around the SDGs is that we moved from the MDGs, which were sector orientated, to the SDGs, which also dealt with the interlinkages between the goals and the targets across them. And I think in the context of PPPs, you don't want a PPP to be doing something here which then has a negative impact over there. So I think having a way of ensuring that you're looking at the impact of the PPPs across all of the SDGs is very important. Someone mentioned the local level. It's a really difficult situation, I think, at the local level, in the sense of the experience, particularly in developing countries in the former Eastern Bloc, to have the experience at the local level to be able to do PPPs. And so I think there's a huge capacity building requirement there. Perhaps there's a need to have somewhere to go to be able to test the PPP at a local level, which can give the advice to a local or subnational government to make them more comfortable about what they're doing. And I think that, often the private sector has a much the local government has a lot less equal relationship with the private sector. So there needs to be an equalization, I think, of the relationship between those, and part of that is building capacity in and within local governments. PPPs should result in an improved outcome for the citizens, and so we need to look at that and whether it is actually going to give an improved quality and it's more affordable. The issues on transparency and accountability were mentioned. Also was mentioned by one of the speakers the issue of kind of regulatory frameworks. They need to be very strong to be able to hold those PPPs accountable, and if they're not, I think that's going to cause a problem. You need to have much better informed monitoring and evaluation, much more, in a sense, insurance that they are not going to have a negative impact on the other areas that the SDGs are active in. So I think that's my first comment, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Felix, thank you very much. I must come and join you in California because obviously it's a place to clear the mind, so well done. We had a discussion, I'm not sure if you were there, about output specifications. There's no doubt about regulatory frameworks, but what we as experts in PPP want to sort of convey is that the output specifications can leverage private sector in ways that are much better than regulation, in the sense that the private sector won't get paid if it doesn't deliver and if it doesn't behave in a transparent, accountable way. The question about transparency and accountability are exceptionally important, as we've all mentioned on the panel. It's translating it in a technical sense into specifications for a contract. I think it's very interesting. Felix is a top expert, as is Claudia, on multi-stakeholder partnerships, but it's very interesting to hear from them their comments on PPP, and I think this dialogue is extremely important. James Goldstein from the Telos Institute. I worry that if James is phoning us from New York, because it will be a bit earlier, maybe he's got, so James, James Goldstein, are you hearing me just now?
Yes, I am, Jeffrey. Can you hear me?
Yes, James, and what time is it with you?
I'm on the East Coast in the U.S., so it's almost 10:30 here.
Thank goodness. All right. Okay, James. Any comments from whereabouts on the East Coast?
In the Boston area.
Also, it's almost 10:30. Exactly. So great. All right. Well, anyway, it's still nearing bedtime. Sorry, James,
Yes.
please, I've got you. Thank you very much. What were, any comments on what you have heard so far?
Yes, I have several. First of all, thank you very much, Jeffrey and Tony, for inviting me to participate, and I do want to commend UNECE for taking the initiative on this and including other stakeholders. I think that's a very important step. I want to put, I guess, a note of caution before all of you around what I perceive as an assumption, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but an assumption in the document that was just circulated, the updated guidance document, that PPPs are appropriate almost across the board. And I think the very first thing one needs to do is to determine whether or not PPPs in a certain circumstance with a certain project is appropriate. And I might suggest, and Felix and I have worked on this together, a set of conditions of suitability. And some of your principles actually would, I think, speak to that threshold issue about whether a project may or may not be suitable. And those might include governance issues and things of that nature. And I also want to say that the People's First approach, while it's a very appealing one rhetorically, and it raises the bar considerably, in my view, as to the number of projects and the types of projects that can meet the broader range of desired outputs for a People's First PPP. And in that, I want to speak specifically to the point of alignment of interests. PPPs, in my view, need to be identified by the public sector. The actual projects, I should say, need to be identified by the public sector in all cases. Not an unsolicited private sector idea for an interesting project, but the public sector. And and that's only one small part of this point. The larger and more important point is that the public and private interests may not align sufficiently to allow a PPP to go forward. For example, obviously, private partners require certain levels of return on their investments depending on their risk perception and ROI requirements. And for many projects, that simply may not be possible within a PPP framework. So I want to have that note of caution that although again, rhetorically, People's First PPPs are very appealing, they may not be as broadly applicable as one might think. Secondly, or next, I really want to re-emphasize something Felix just said, but I cannot stress this enough. The unequal playing field between a private sector consortium that may be doing PPPs all over the world with teams, and I'm talking large teams of highly paid, highly qualified, highly experienced accountants, engineers, financiers, it's on and on and on, you know, all the different expertise that is necessary, versus a public sector entity that in almost every case has less experience, less continuity of the team, again, are not in a balanced position to negotiate, implement, oversee, and enforce these agreements. And Felix mentioned something else which I think is also extremely important. Many PPPs, and the gentleman from Lebanon also mentioned it, often are initiated by subnational governments, either local or provincial governments. They are, unfortunately, even less able to have the team of expertise in-house, at least, required for these PPPs. And your guest from Belarus actually, I think, spoke to this issue very well when she mentioned that they need international expertise to help them understand PPPs and even guide them to not only understand them, but to negotiate perhaps a pilot PPP and so forth. And one of the things I've thought a bit about and have mentioned to the UN's interagency task force on PPPs is the idea of establishing an independent, sectoral, if you will, team of experts, and perhaps regionally based teams of experts to help countries and subnational governments, if there really is going to be a large number of PPPs, there needs to be expertise provided to, in particular, subnational governments, but many national governments in developing countries as well. I have more to say, but I think I'll leave it here for now. Happy to say more if there are questions. I will say one other thing about the alignment or lack of alignment of interests. When we talk about access in the SDGs, there is a real tension between access and affordability and private sector return requirements. So that's why, Jeffrey, I think at the beginning you talked about certain sectors having clear revenue streams like transportation and energy, and others perhaps less clear revenue streams. This is a major issue in terms of the SDGs promoting full access versus private sector needs for certain returns, and therefore affordability becomes an issue. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent, absolutely excellent. Look, I'm not sure just how to go forward in this. First of all, comments on what has been mentioned. Claudia made a comment on, and I think it was extremely important that she told us about consistency, and let's not have guidelines everywhere. Let's try and bring everyone together within the UN, and also now I think it's clear that we have to, as echoing a point made by by Ziad, that we have to bring in the civil society and people with this expertise as well. But we've also now heard from Felix and also from James. Our comments like, and the difficulty about capacity building and the need to have some kind of expertise center that's sort of independent, and this is a little bit the comment, this was also Raymond Sanner's point about the need for this body. So in fact, some of the suggestions coming out from here are also echoed amongst the network here about a kind of expertise center to develop projects and helping particularly local governments. And we hear you. It would be great to have a pot of money, but it's just not at the moment. At the moment, I don't see that pot of money. But anyway, can we make some comments now on what we've heard? I think the first point is the sectors. What sectors are, from experience, not appropriate for PPP? Is anyone going to handle that question from our groups? In their experience, or in your experience, have there been projects where you find that the sector involved is just too impossible for PPP to be successful and therefore able to meet the SDGs? So I think I don't get anyone thinking. I don't get anyone telling us, yes, please, and just if you could mention your, yeah, just if we could give a microphone, please. And I know you're an expert on transport, so, and a very top-level expert as well, so please, just say who you are.
Okay, my name is Pete Bannister. I'm a retired government economist from Australia, worked for Western Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. I originally was a transport specialist and went for that purpose to a PPP unit in New South Wales Treasury. But there, they had a very wide array of projects. Among them, they had prisons, they had prison hospitals, they had low-cost housing projects. They were all very difficult, but they were not impossible. The specification of the required outputs, though, was the major difficulty. They are summarised in compulsory contract summaries that are left with the Parliament of New South Wales, which describe the contracts, the immediate results after the phase of construction. They are rarely revisited, say 5 or 10 years later though. So Parliament gets a report that says this low-cost housing scheme is executed in this way, the essence of the contract, these things, the financial details are given, the reports are perhaps 100 pages long, but there's no going back later, though the contract lasts for 30 to 50 years, to look at how they're going. So there are good features and there are bad features. That's enough, I think. The range of projects includes water treatment plants, even hydroelectric schemes. Is that enough from me?
Thank you. That's extremely interesting, and I know with Australia there is top-level expertise there. Of course, all Australians can do anything that they're such a great country, so I don't see negativity ever coming. Yes, please, Peter, yes.
Thanks for saying that. Something I forgot to mention, training is absolutely essential. We did our own. We had a small unit and 2 old guys trained the kids.
Yeah.
Big drawback though, the kids that we trained all went off to the private sector.
Yes, yes. Well, this is a recurrent theme. How do you get people you train? Well, it's obviously human nature. People want to move on and get the higher salaries, but that's the way of things. Yes, Richard. I've actually got 4 minutes left, haven't I? Yeah, 3 minutes now.
Very quickly, I think the view that the private sector only makes money is quite outdated. There's an entire generation of impact investors, and they're led in California by Google and people like that, Hewlett Packard and others.
Richard, we can't hear you. Could you put the microphone on a little bit better? Thank you.
Is this better?
Yes, yes.
I think the concept that the private sector only needs to make money is outdated. It's history. There's an entire group of impact investors, and they're being led by companies like Google, Hewlett Packard, and others. And what they look for is a combined return, 1, social good, and 2, return on investment. So we see projects coming together where there may be an 18 or 19% return on a for-profit project coupled with providing energy or providing light to villages in Africa. By combining those projects, you get a blended return, a combination of impact and for-profit investment. This echoes the lines of our friend from Lebanon who spoke so elegantly on the need for social good.
Excellent. Well, sadly, thank you very much, Richard, for that point. I think we've had a very interesting discussion. Sadly, we have to draw it to a conclusion.
Could I just...
Ziad, I've only given 30 seconds,
okay.
Very briefly, Ziad.
Sorry, I'll be very quick. I just want to clarify something. When we talk about civil society, I don't think we're talking about civil society as a whole as, a disparate group. We're talking about the stakeholders, particular stakeholders within civil society. Just wanted to clarify that.
Oh.
And the other thing is that, I just want to say that the practical person in me wants to see us working not forgetting what James was talking about, that we need to evaluate every project and not think of PPP as an ideology on its merits. The idealist in me wants to see partnership grow into being a solidarity, concept of solidarity in society among the various components.
Well, look, I think this is great, because I think we've now come to a point where people are moving together, and we've got some top people within the multi-stakeholder discussion, James, Felix, Claudia. I think that's been excellent to have them in. I want to thank also our technical staff, because for the first time I'm actually able to see them and listen to them without problems. So thank you very much, and thank you too for joining us and making these absolutely excellent comments. So we're going to do it again. That's always a good UN thing. We're going to do it again, and we'll do it somewhere else. But thank you all, and to Ziad, and to Alekos, and to Irina, thank you so much for your excellent contribution to this very interesting discussion. So thank you very much, and we'll resume just after 10, 5 past 10 maybe, Tony? Sorry, 5 past 11, 5 past 11. Thank you very much, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.